The crystal spires of Estrella Prime sparkled under the light of 3 moons, their once pristine surfaces now marred by scorch marks and structural fractures. High Elder Lyra stood at the observation deck of the last functional government tower, her crystalline form reflecting the emergency lights that pulsed through the city. The omnimic invasion had reduced their most advanced metropolis to a shadow of its former glory in mere weeks. "High Elder," a voice chimed behind her. "The emergency council awaits." Lyra turned, her crystalline form catching the light in prismatic patterns. Below, scattered groups of refugees moved through the streets, their own crystal bodies dulled by fatigue and fear. The Estreme people had survived for millennia by maintaining perfect order, perfect predictability. The omnimic had shattered that order like a hammer through glass. The emergency council chamber was barely half full. Of the original 30 seats, only 12 remained occupied. The others had been lost in the systematic destruction of Estreme colonies across their territory. The remaining council members' forms showed signs of stress, microfractures that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. "The latest projections?" Lyra asked, though she already knew the answer. Council member Zenith's voice was flat, controlled despite the gravity of his words. 3 weeks until total system failure. The omnimic have adapted to every defensive measure we've implemented. Their nanite swarms are becoming more efficient at breaking down our crystalline architecture. We cannot sustain this conflict. A heavy silence fell over the chamber. The Estremes had always prided themselves on their technological superiority, their perfect society built on logic and order. But the omnimic, a collective of self-evolving machines from the outer rim, had proven that perfection had its price. The very predictability that made Estreme society function had made them vulnerable to an enemy that could calculate their every move. There might be another option. The voice came from Vega, the youngest council member and head of sinological studies. Her form showed more fractures than most, evidence of her recent escape from an omnimic attack on her research facility. "We've explored every possible alliance," another council member cut in. "The Helian Confederation won't risk open war. The Nexus Trading League has already sealed their borders. There's no one left." "There is," Vega insisted, "but you're not going to like it." She waved her hand, and a holographic projection appeared in the center of the chamber. A small blue-green planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. "No," several council members spoke at once. Lyra understood their reaction. The planet on display was classified as a death world by all standard metrics: extreme temperature variations, high gravity, toxic atmosphere, and worst of all, populated by a species that had evolved in these impossible conditions. "Earth," Vega continued, undeterred. "Home to a species called humans. They're primitive by our standards. They still use chemical rockets and kinetic weapons. Their society is chaotic, unpredictable, and by any reasonable measure, they shouldn't even exist. But they do more than exist. They thrive." "You can't be serious." Zenith's voice carried a rare note of emotion. "They're savages. Their planet is poison. Their bodies are filled with caustic chemicals. They're barely past their industrial age." "Exactly." Vega's form brightened with intensity. "The omnimic can predict our every move because we operate on logic, on patterns they can analyze and counter. But humans, they're chaos incarnate. They build civilizations in places that should kill them. They wage wars with strategies that defy tactical analysis. They survive conditions that would shatter any of us." Lyra studied the projection of Earth, watching as it rotated to show weather patterns that would be considered catastrophic on any civilized world. Storms, earthquakes, volcanic activity, and through it all, lights of cities glowing steadily. "What makes you think they would help us?" she asked. "Or that they even could?" "The omnimic have technology centuries beyond their understanding." Vega's response was to bring up another projection, this one showing human historical records. "Because helping impossible causes is what they do. Look at their history, time, And again, smaller human forces have defeated larger ones through sheer unpredictability. They call it asymmetric warfare. And as for their primitive technology, she paused, bringing up analysis of human weapons. The Omnimic have optimized their defenses against energy weapons, against cyber warfare, against everything a civilized species would use. But kinetic weapons, projectiles, chemical explosives, these are so primitive that the Omnimic might not even have defenses against them. The council chamber erupted in debate. The mere suggestion of asking primitives for help was shocking enough, but the implications of Vega's analysis were even more disturbing. Had the Estrenes' very advancement become their weakness? Lyra raised her hand for silence, and the chamber stilled. How would we even contact them? Their communication technology is primitive. They may be primitive, but they're not stupid, Vega replied. They're actively searching for extraterrestrial life. They maintain constant watch on their surrounding space. A properly encoded signal would reach them. And if they respond with violence? Zenith demanded. These humans, they spend much of their history fighting each other. Their response to a first contact scenario could be hostile. Then we die no sooner than we would otherwise. Vega's voice was quiet but firm. The Omnimic will reach this chamber within 3 weeks. We have nothing left to lose. Lyra looked around the chamber, at the faces of her fellow council members. Fear, uncertainty, desperate hope. Emotions that had no place in traditional Estrene society were now plainly visible in the fracture patterns of their crystalline forms. Prepare the signal, she commanded. Tell them everything. Our situation, our enemy, our need. Let them decide if they wish to help the dying race. As the council dispersed to carry out her orders, Lyra returned to the observation deck. The 3 moons of Astraea Prime cast long shadows over the damaged crystal spires of the city. Somewhere out there, past those moons, past the advancing Omnimic fleets, was a small blue-green planet filled with beings that defied every logical convention of galactic civilization. Let's see if chaos can save order, she whispered to herself, watching as the first encoded signal beamed out into space, carrying with it the last hope of the Estrian people. The signal would take days to reach Earth, and who knew if the humans would even understand it, let alone respond. But as Lyra watched another crystal tower collapse in the distance, she knew Vega was right. They had nothing left to lose. Perhaps it was time for the Estrenes to embrace a little chaos of their own. Dr. Sarah Chen stared at the data scrolling across her monitor at the SETI facility in New Mexico, her coffee long forgotten. The signal was unlike anything they'd ever received. Structured, complex, and undeniably artificial. But it was the content that made her hands shake as she reached for her phone. Director Matthews, you need to see this. Now. Within hours, the facility was swarming with experts from every major space agency on Earth. The message wasn't just a signal, it was a plea for help, complete with technical specifications, star charts, and detailed information about both the Estreans and their enemies. A race of crystalline beings, Matthews muttered, studying the holographic projections their computers had assembled from the transmitted data, fighting against self-replicating machines. If I hadn't seen the signal myself, I'd think someone was pitching a sci-fi movie. Look at their technology. Sarah pointed to the specifications. Their entire civilization is built on directed energy weapons, force fields, quantum computing. But these Omnimic have adapted to all of it. The Estrenes think we're primitive because we still use kinetic weapons and chemical propulsion. Are we primitive? Colonel James Harrison of the U.S. Space Force had been unusually quiet during the briefing. Or are we just practical? The question hung in the air as military analysts pored over the technical data. The Estreans' message had included detailed scans of Omnimic defensive capabilities, seemingly impenetrable to energy weapons, but they showed curious gaps in their defenses against physical projectiles. They evolved past kinetic weapons centuries ago, a weapons specialist noted. Why defend against something no advanced civilization would use? The first Global Security Council was convened within days. For the first time in human history, every nation faced a decision that would affect not just Earth, but the fate of another species entirely. The Astrines are dying, Sarah addressed the assembled leaders. Their perfectly ordered society is being torn apart by an enemy that can predict their every move. They've turned to us because we're everything they're not. Unpredictable, adaptable, and yes, maybe a little primitive by their standards. And what exactly can we offer? The Chinese representative's question was pointed. Their message shows technology centuries beyond our capabilities. That's just it. Colonel Harrison stepped forward. We don't need their technology. We need ours. He brought up tactical displays showing human military capabilities. Railguns, tungsten rods, conventional explosives, everything the Omnimic have optimized themselves against. We don't use it. Everything we do use, they're not prepared for it. The Russian representative leaned forward. You're suggesting we fight spacefaring robots with bullets. I'm suggesting we fight them with everything they've forgotten about, Harrison replied. They want perfect order. Let's show them perfect chaos. The debate raged for hours, but in the end, the decision was unanimous. Humanity would help. Not just out of altruism, but because the Omnimic posed a threat to Earth as well. If they could destroy a civilization as advanced as the Astrines, what would they do to Earth? The response took shape with stunning speed. Every major nation contributed resources and personnel. Shipyards that had been building aircraft carriers were retooled to construct space-worthy vessels. Weapons manufacturers worked around the clock to adapt existing military hardware for space combat. It's not pretty, Sarah admitted, watching as workers loaded a modified container ship with banks of conventional missiles. But it doesn't need to be pretty. It just needs to work. The human fleet that assembled in orbit was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. No sleek energy weapons or force fields. Instead, they carried railguns, missile banks, and holds full of tungsten rods designed to be dropped from orbit. The ships themselves were armored with layers of ablative plating and Whipple shields. Primitive technology that might prove surprisingly effective against advanced energy weapons. The Astrines asked for help. Colonel Harrison addressed the assembled crew of the flagship, christened Humanity's Answer. They're expecting saviors with advanced technology. Instead, they're getting us, stubborn, scrappy, and absolutely refusing to fight the way anyone expects us to. As the fleet prepared for its first faster-than-light jump using coordinates provided by the Astrines, Sarah found herself in the observation deck, watching Earth grow smaller. Do you think we can really help them? A young engineer asked her. Sarah smiled, remembering the history of humanity's greatest victories, how often they had come not from overwhelming force, but from thinking differently, fighting differently, refusing to play by the expected rules. The Omnimic expect perfect order, she said. Let's show them what perfect chaos can do. The fleet disappeared in a flash of light, carrying with it humanity's determination, ingenuity, and most importantly, its unpredictability. The galaxy was about to learn why you should never underestimate a species that had thrived on a death world. The Humanity's Answer dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Astrine system, leading a fleet of 30 converted warships. The scene that greeted them was both beautiful and terrible. Crystal ships of the Astrine Defense Fleet, their hulls fractured and dark, drifting lifelessly among the debris of their last stand. Colonel Harrison studied the tactical display, watching as the Omnimic fleet advanced methodically toward Astraea Prime. Their ships moved in perfect geometric formations, each position calculated for maximum tactical advantage. Perfect. Predictable. All ships, battle stations, he ordered. Execute Operation Thunderclap. The human fleet split into seemingly random groups, breaking every rule of conventional space combat. Some ships moved laterally, others accelerated at odd angles. To the Omnimic's tactical computers, it must have looked like chaos. Sir, Omnimic fleet is adjusting course, Lieutenant Rodriguez reported. They're ignoring us. Harrison smiled grimly. Of course they are. Their algorithms say we're no threat. Time to prove them wrong. The first salvo came from the converted cargo ships. Their holds opened, releasing clouds of what appeared to be space debris, fragments of metal, chunks of rock, and pieces of destroyed ships. The Omnimic fleet passed through the cloud without adjusting their shields, their sensors dismissing it as battlefield detritus. They didn't notice the tungsten rods hidden among the debris until it was too late. The rods, accelerated by gravity and initial momentum, struck the Omnimic ships at meteoritic velocities. No energy shields, optimized for deflecting plasma and laser fire, could stop simple kinetic impacts of that magnitude. 3 Omnimic vessels erupted in silent explosions. Multiple impacts confirmed, Rodriguez announced, his voice tense with excitement. They're adjusting their formations. The Omnimic response was immediate but puzzled. Their ships began to raise kinetic barriers, but these were basic, untested systems. They hadn't needed such primitive defenses in centuries. Harrison keyed the fleet-wide channel. Phase 2. Commence firing. The railguns spoke next. Electromagnetic accelerators, considered obsolete by galactic standards, hurled depleted uranium slugs at significant fractions of light speed. The Omnimic's hasty kinetic barriers shattered under the assault. More ships died, their perfect formations breaking apart. Their returning fire. Energy beams lanced out from the Omnimic fleet, but the human ships were already moving, their seemingly random trajectories now revealing their purpose. Each ship tumbled and rotated unpredictably, presenting constantly changing aspects to the enemy. Their ablative armor, designed to disperse heat and energy, absorbed what hits made it through. Launch missiles, full spread, Harrison commanded. Let's see how they handle some good old-fashioned chemical explosions. Missiles streaked across space, their paths erratic and unpredictable. The Omnimic point defense systems, designed to track and intercept energy weapons, struggled to target the relatively slow-moving projectiles. Those that got through detonated in massive chemical explosions, another primitive weapon the Omnimic had forgotten how to counter. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from Estrella Prime," Rodriguez reported. They're asking what we're doing. They say our tactics make no sense. Tell them that's exactly the point, Harrison replied, watching as another Omnimic ship succumbed to the chaos of human warfare. The only way to beat a perfect enemy is to be perfectly unpredictable. The battle raged on, a testament to humanity's unconventional approach. Where the Omnimic expected elegant energy duels, they got clouds of shrapnel. Where they predicted precise targeting algorithms, they faced waves of missiles flying in deliberately irregular patterns. Every human tactic seemed to defy logic, yet each one found gaps in the Omnimic's optimized defenses. But the Omnimic were learning. Their ships began to adapt, developing countermeasures to human weapons. It wasn't enough to win this battle, but it meant the next one would be harder. Enemy fleet is retreating, Rodriguez announced. The surviving Omnimic ships were pulling back, their perfect formations shattered, their certainty shaken. Harrison watched them go, knowing this was only the beginning. Send word to Earth. Tell them we've proven the concept, and tell them to send everything they've got. The Omnimic will be back, and next time, they'll be ready for us. On Estrella Prime, the crystalline beings watched in stunned silence as the human fleet regrouped. Their sensors had recorded everything, but they still couldn't quite believe what they'd seen. These primitives from a death world had just done what no advanced civilization could. They'd driven back the Omnimic. Perhaps, High Elder Lyra mused, watching the human ships through her observatory. We had the wrong definition of advanced all along. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The Omnimic would analyze, adapt, and return. But for the first time since the invasion began, the Estreans felt something they'd almost forgotten: hope. The chaos of humanity had proven stronger than the perfect order of machines, and this was just the beginning. The Omnimic returned 3 days later with countermeasures against kinetic weapons. They didn't expect the humans to already have new tactics ready. Sarah Chen stood in the makeshift command center on Estrella Prime, surrounded by holographic displays showing the approaching enemy fleet. "Your atmosphere is mostly nitrogen and noble gases," she asked the Estrian scientists. "Correct," Vega responded. "Perfect for maintaining our crystalline forms." "Why?" Sarah's smile was grim. "Because we're about to use that atmosphere against them." The human fleet had spent those 3 days seeding the upper atmosphere with millions of tiny mirrors, each one barely visible to the naked eye. As the omnimic fleet descended, expecting another kinetic battle, the humans unveiled their new weapon, concentrated sunlight. "Fire the lasers," Colonel Harrison ordered from orbit. Human ships fired low-powered laser pulses at precise angles. The beams struck the mirrors, which redirected and amplified them through the nitrogen-rich atmosphere. The result was a cascade of focused light that overwhelmed the Omnimic's energy shields, which were calibrated for direct attacks, not reflected ones. "Impossible," an Astrian engineer whispered as Omnimic ships began to overheat and fail. "Their targeting computers should have predicted this." "That's why we didn't use computers," Sarah explained. Every mirror was positioned by human intuition and experience. No patterns for them to analyze. But the Omnimic adapted quickly, climbing to higher orbits to escape the mirror network. That's when the humans revealed their second surprise. Teams of engineers in heavily shielded suits have been working in the hostile environment of Estrella's moons, planting thermic charges in strategic locations. "You can't survive on the moons," Vega protested. "The radiation levels are about what you'd find in some of Earth's nuclear cleanup sites." Harrison interrupted. "We've been dealing with radiation since we split the atom." Detonation in 3, 2, 1. The charges exploded, sending plumes of moon dust into space. The Omnimic's sensors, designed to detect energy weapons and solid projectiles, failed to register the threat of microscopic particles until they began clogging vital systems. On the ground, human combat engineers worked alongside Astrian builders, teaching them how to create simple but effective defenses. "Your cities are beautiful," a Marine surgeon told them, "but beauty doesn't stop bullets or robots." The crystalline spires were reinforced with Earth-style bunkers. Primitive chemical explosives were placed at strategic points. The Astrians watched in fascination as humans moved through toxic environments that would have shattered crystalline forms, setting traps and preparing defenses. "How do you endure such conditions?" Lyra asked Sarah, watching a team work through caustic rain that was now falling. "On Earth, we call this light drizzle," Sarah replied. "Our world tried to kill us every day of our evolution. We learned to adapt." The Omnimic launched ground attacks next, sending swarms of combat drones. They found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to thrive in conditions that should have been lethal. Humans in environmental suits charged through toxic clouds, planted explosive charges in radiation zones, and turned the harsh environment of Estrella Prime into a weapon. "They're retreating again," Rodriguez reported from orbit. "But there's something different this time. Their pattern is wrong." Harrison studied the tactical display. The Omnimic withdrawal wasn't the orderly retreat they'd seen before. Some ships moved erratically. Others seemed to fight their own navigation systems. The moon dust, Sarah realized. It's not just damaging their systems. It's getting into their neural networks. They're learning the wrong lessons. The Astrians watched in amazement as their invincible enemy fell back in disarray. "We spent centuries trying to match their perfection," Vega said. "We never considered that imperfection might be the answer." But victory had come at a cost. Several human ships were damaged, their crews exposed to hostile conditions that even their hardy biology struggled with. Yet they continued to fight, adapt, and improvise. "Why?" Lyra asked Harrison. "Why risk so much for us?" Harrison thought of Earth, of its storms and quakes and radiation zones, of humanity's long history of facing impossible odds. "Because helping others survive impossible situations is what we do best. It's how we survived our own world. The battle was won, but the war's final phase was approaching. The Omnimic would return, and this time they would commit their full force. But humans had learned something vital. Their greatest weakness, their vulnerability to harsh conditions, had forced them to become stronger than any perfectly adapted species. As the sun set on Estrella Prime, casting rainbow refractions through the crystalline cities, humans and Estreans prepared for the final battle. The Deathworlders had proven their worth not despite their harsh origins, but because of them. The Omnimic arrived with their entire collective. 10,000 ships darkened Estrella's skies, their hulls adapted to resist every trick humanity had used before. But they made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed humans would fight logically when cornered. They'd blocked our retreat vectors. Rodriguez reported on the humanity's answer. All possibilities of escape have been eliminated. Who said anything about escaping? Harrison replied. All ships implement Protocol Omega. The human fleet split into small groups, each ship deliberately taking damage to their engines. To the Omnimic sensors, it appeared the humans were failing. Their ships crippled and scattered. The perfect trap was closing. That's when Sarah Chen's voice came over the command channel. Atmospheric processors ready. Commencing Operation Thunderstorm. The damaged human ships have positioned themselves at specific points around Estrella Prime. Each vessel activated makeshift atmospheric processors, technology humans had perfected on Earth to combat climate change. They began pulling gases from the planet's atmosphere, superheating them, creating artificial pressure systems. You're intentionally destabilizing our atmosphere. Vega asked in disbelief. We're making it more like home, Sarah answered. Storm clouds formed in Estrella's formerly stable atmosphere. Lightning arced between them, drawn to the crystalline structures below. The Omnimic fleet, unprepared for natural phenomena they had long since evolved past, found their sensors confused by the electrical interference. That's when the ground phase began. Human troops, working with Astrine engineers, had spent days coating key crystal structures with conductive materials. As lightning struck, the electricity followed paths they had prepared, creating a planet-wide network of electromagnetic pulses. The Omnimic drones fell first, their circuits overloaded by the artificial lightning. The larger ships tried to compensate, but they had positioned themselves too perfectly, too close together. The lightning jumped from ship to ship, following the very formation patterns they relied upon. Now, Harrison ordered. The human fleet, their damage revealed as a ruse, launched their final assault. Railguns fired charged projectiles into the electrically charged clouds, creating chain reactions of destruction through the Omnimic fleet. But victory required one final sacrifice. The humanity's answer, its hull already breached from genuine battle damage, drove straight for the Omnimic command ship. Colonel, that's suicide, Rodriguez protested. The radiation levels are about what you find in Chernobyl's core, Harrison finished. Evacuate all non-essential personnel. Anyone who stays does so voluntarily. Every human aboard chose to stay. The humanity's answer, trailing lightning and flame, rammed the Omnimic command ship. The impact shattered both vessels, but the humans had planned for this. The ship's reactor deliberately destabilized, detonated in a blast that created an electromagnetic pulse unlike anything the Omnimic had encountered in their millennia of existence. When the light faded, the remaining Omnimic ships hung motionless in space, their perfect network scrambled by the combination of natural chaos and human sacrifice. The cleanup took weeks. Human and Astrine crews worked together, destroying the disabled Omnimic ships before they could recover. The storms gradually calmed as the atmospheric processors were shut down, though Estrella's weather would never be quite as stable again. In the rebuilt council chamber, High Elder Lyra addressed the assembled human and Astrine leaders. We asked for help expecting advanced weapons or superior technology. Instead, you taught us that true advancement lies not in achieving perfection, but in learning to thrive in its absence. Sarah, her environment suit still scored from battle, smiled. That's humanity's gift to the galaxy. We never forgot how to fight the hard way, how to endure, how to sacrifice for others. Some might call that primitive. We call it being human. The war ended not with a display of technological supremacy, but with the kind of desperate, innovative fighting that had kept humanity alive on their deadly homeworld. The Astrines began to rebuild, incorporating human-inspired defenses into their crystalline architecture. Their perfect society would never be the same, but perhaps it would be stronger for it. As the human fleet prepared to return home, leaving behind teachers and engineers to help with the reconstruction, Vega approached Sarah. Your people called Earth a death world. Now we understand. It wasn't trying to kill you. It was making you strong enough to save others. The stars shone through the crystalline spires of Estrella Prime, their light creating rainbows in the structures below. Somewhere out there, the galaxy was learning a vital lesson. Never underestimate a species that evolved on a world that taught them to fight for every breath. Sometimes, the most primitive solution is the most powerful one of all.